Picture this, an infinite void in which nothing ever changes, nothing even stirs, in the middle of which a soul being is wrapped in eternal self-contemplation. Then he or she or it moves, creating out of itself the sky and the earth and the mountains, or creating out of itself other beings like itself. Or it may divide in half into male and female, and the two halves begin to desire each other. Or picture this, the soul being thinks or wills or dreams into existence the sky and then the earth, and then covers the earth with plants, forest, animals, and finally human beings. Or this, a father sky lies on top of Mother Earth in such a close embrace that the children they breed have no light by which to see, no room to move around, and they eventually agree to join forces to push their parents apart. Or this, a cosmic egg floats on the eternal and motionless waters for millennia. One day it cracks open, and from it emerges a being who will create the cosmos, or maybe even the cosmos itself. Or this, a tiny animal is sent down into those still, deep, primeval waters to bring up a tiny bit of sand or mud, which is spread on the back of a tortoise, and it expands to become the earth. Or this, a giant or monster is defeated by a god who then takes the monster's body apart and from its parts creates the universe. Its head becomes the sky, its eyes the sun and moon, its bones the rocks and mountains, its hair the trees, and its blood the rivers and seas. Or one more, a giant boar raises a sleeping earth with its tusks from deep in the primeval sea and brings it up and sets it afloat, where it will float for the next billion years. These are just a few of the myths that we'll be looking at in the first unit. Creation myths are logical places for us to start, since so many people across so many times and from different cultures have asked the same kinds of questions. How did the earth and the heavens get here? Where did they come from? Why are they the way they are? What is it that preserves them, that holds them together, that keeps everything moving? Are they eternal, or are they destined to sink back into chaos sometime in the future? Were they made for us, for our use and convenience, or were we created to service and manage and cultivate and care for them? And whose use anyway was this cosmos made for our own or for the gods? Are we intentional, or are we some kind of accidental tourists on this spaceship? The questions, people also ask the questions about us, about ourselves. Who are we? How did we get here? Did some god or goddess make us out of stone or wood or mud with his or her own hands, out of clay and straw on a potter's wheel? Or are we children of mating gods or of the sky and the earth? Did we emerge from some androgynous being who sweated or expectorated us into existence? Did a primeval rock split to release our first parents? Or did it, when it split, release two gods who became our ancestors? Did we come from an egg? If so, what kind of an egg? And where did the egg come from? What kind of bird could possibly have laid it? Once we're here, another whole set of questions comes up. What is our relationship with the cosmos? Are we caretakers, or are we masters? Are the animals and birds and plants and rocks our brothers and sisters, or were they put here for our use and convenience? What obligations do we have to the powers that created this place and put us here? These are questions which, over time, people have asked over and over again. They're questions that we've asked ourselves, or we've asked our priests, or our scientists, or our spiritual guides, or, in maybe one of the hardest scenarios, our children have asked us these questions, and we've had to come up with some kind of answer for them. Because where we come from, and who we are, and why we're here, are questions that all people in all cultures have asked themselves all the time. The myths that these people have left behind can provide us with at least the way that they answered these questions, which I think can help us and guide us in framing our own answers to these questions. And that's why In the first unit of our course, we will be dealing with creation myths. That's what the first unit is all about. Because in it, we'll see how peoples of many different times of places have answered these and other questions. Since so many creation myths picture chaos as a vast, empty, motionless primal sea out of which forms emerge, and continue to see creation as surrounded on all sides by infinite waters, many stories and myths also consider the possibility of everything sinking back into the inertia of pre-creation. And that may account for the number of flood stories that we see. We'll look at a great variety of flood stories across the world, including the one that we probably know best, the story of Noah's Ark. And these are some of the questions we'll be asking about those flood stories. What do they tell us about the ways we think of the cosmos itself? What do we need to do to keep creation from slipping back into chaos as it does in the flood stories? Are flood stories endings, or are they beginnings, or are they both? If and when the earth reemerges from the primal waters, is it new and improved over the initial creation? Is it the same, only renewed in some way? Or does it emerge a little the worse for wear and tear? We'll end our first unit with myths of cosmic destruction. How will the cosmos end? Will it end? How do we know if it is going to end? How do we know when the end is getting close? After it's destroyed, will it be recreated? And if so, along what kind of lines? Apocalyptic myths are interesting because they run creation stories backwards back to the point before which anything happened. But then we say, what then? What happens next? And we'll get a chance to look at a variety of answers to these questions at the end of our first unit. Our second unit, which will take us about 9 lectures, will deal with myths of gods and goddesses. And what we'll try to do in this unit is try to see how the human apprehension of gods and goddesses changes over time. We'll start by attempting to reconstruct what the gods and goddesses were like for Paleolithic and Neolithic men and women. This is admittedly somewhat conjectural and undertaking, but then we'll trace the apprehension of the gods and goddesses through the agricultural revolution, through the building of the first cities, and into the establishment of the first great pantheons. And we'll also try to take a look at the ways in which it seems over time sky gods gradually came to usurp more and more of power that seems originally to have belonged to goddesses. And we'll also look at some of the implications of that takeover, assuming that it really did happen. And also we'll take a look at some of the ways that human beings have tried to compensate for the fact that a sky god is very remote, is very transcendent, is very detached from the world that he created and from us. And we'll take a look at some of the ways through time that people have tried to diminish this distance to bring ourselves closer to God or God closer to us. This second unit will also give us a chance to look at some really good myths. One of them, and I think is one of the most powerful and interesting in history, is the myth of Isis and Osiris of Egypt, and we'll spend an entire lecture on that one. And there's some other interesting questions that come up about the gods and the goddesses in this unit. Why do we picture the gods the way we do? What kind of religious functions, what kind of everyday functions do they perform for us that requires us to think of them in certain kinds of ways? What difference does it make to us in terms of our relationship to the earth and to each other, whether we think we are born from a mother goddess or we are made by a sky god who may work with tools the way a craftsman does? What are the implications of thinking of creation as a birth versus thinking of it as an art or a crafts project? We'll get a chance again to see how lots of different people answered these questions in the myths of the second unit. Unit 3 will be myths about heroes, and here we're going to get some of the best stories in the world, including Gilgamesh and King Arthur and Jason and the Argonauts, the African Mewendo, Demeter and Persephone, and many others. This unit 2 will raise a lot of, I think, good questions. What makes a hero a hero? Do different cultures in different times value different heroic qualities? Who decides who gets to be a hero? How do we commemorate our heroes? And does a hero do his or her heroic thing entirely for him or herself? Or is there some benefit for the rest of us in what he or she does? Should a hero start his or her quest thinking about benefits for all of us, or is that irrelevant to a hero's quest? Is a hero who dies for a lost cause as heroic as one who lives for one that survives or succeeds? We'll set in that unit, we'll set lots of heroes and hero myths from different cultures side by side. And in the process, we'll inevitably notice some striking similarities, which will raise the question of the monomyth. That is, a monomyth is a kind of universal story of the hero that transcends cultural differences to make one grand story, the heroic story. We'll look more closely at two such monomyth theories, one by Otto Rank and one by Joseph Campbell, and we'll ask, what would such a universal hero look like? The idea of the monomyth, when we get there, we'll see that it's still controversial. So what we'll do is try to present evidence on both sides and let you decide for yourselves if you think it's viable or useful. But we can use it as an analytical tool to see what it can tell us about individual heroes that we look at. We'll also get a chance to use our psychological tool from Doty's toolkit in this unit, since psychological readings of myths are the preferred ways of both monomyth theories that we'll look at, and perhaps the favorite way generally that the 20th and 21st centuries have read myths. In psychological readings, heroes have adventures not in the external world, but in the internal one. The quests that heroes undertake are internal journeys into our own hearts of darkness. The demons and dragons and monsters they encounter live in our own unconscious, and they have to be fought with and defeated in order to bring back the boon so that the hero can live as an integrated, mature, individuated human being. Beowulf, just to pick a random example, Beowulf in his story fights monsters which in a psychological reading are really parts of himself. And killing them on his own internal quest sets him up to become the great man and king he becomes later in the poem. There'll be lots of good ideas and stories in this third unit. The fourth unit takes up the question of the trickster, and we move into the land of the trickster in that fourth unit. The trickster is a virtually ubiquitous figure in world mythology. In the old world, the trickster may be a god like Prometheus or Hermes or Enki, or a semi-divine character like the enigmatic Loki from Norse mythology. In the New World in Africa, the trickster is usually associated with an animal, with raven, with mink, with blue jay, with hare, with coyote, with spider, with tortoise. The trickster is always a troublemaker, usually motivated by huge appetites for food and sex, and he enjoys what he gets even more when he gets them for nothing, by playing tricks rather than by working for them. In almost all cultures, tricksters are at least partly comic characters, and their stories are enjoyed half for the tricks they play on others and half for the times when the trickster gets caught up by his own schemes, because the trickster turns out to be often too tricky by half. An example of a trickster story, this one comes from the Brûlé Sioux, and it's a fairly late provenance of this story, not the oldest Native American story in the world, because it has a white trader in it, a trader who runs a trading post. But it does make a point about how tricksters work and what tricksters are like. The trader brags that he's been cheating Indians for years and that no one will ever get the best of him. He's the shrewdest man alive. Everyone keeps telling him about this character named Coyote, who's so clever that they say, I think he could get the best of you. Eventually, the trader gets curious enough to hunt up Coyote, seek him out, and challenge him to a contest to see who can outsmart whom. The Coyote says, well, he'd like to. It sounds interesting, but he's left his cheating medicine at home. And the trader says, well, go get it. And the Coyote says, I live a long ways from here, and I'm on foot, and it would take me forever to get there and get back again. And he says, on the other hand, if I could borrow your horse, I could be there and back in just a couple of minutes. And the trader says, okay, but hurry back with your cheating medicine so we can have our contest. And then the Coyote looks at the horse and he says, you know, the other thing is I'm not a very good rider. I'm even a little frightened of horses, and that horse doesn't know who I am, doesn't know me. So if I could just borrow your clothes, the horse will think that it's you instead of me, and I won't have any problems. And the trader says, okay, your clothes, but now go get your cheating medicine. And then he stands and watches as Coyote rides off with the horse and the clothes, neither of which the trader ever sees again. We get a nice picture of him at the end, standing out in the middle of nowhere without any clothes. The trickster wins this time, but he doesn't always win. About half the time, he gets tripped up by his own devices. Many tricksters, like that one, are told just for fun. But the trickster is always a more complicated character than this. A trickster is also a culture hero. That is, he helps to arrange the world that we still live in. He may teach people how to catch fish, or he brings water to them, as Raven does in the story that we looked at in the last lecture. He may put the sun in its place and get it moving across the sky. He may also be responsible for damaged and crippled people in the world. He may even introduce death into it. He doesn't do good things because he's trying to be nice or helpful, nor does he do bad things because he's malicious. He's just curious and mischievous, and he needs to be in the middle of things. He goes wherever the impulse leads him, paying no attention to rules or consequences. It's this odd combination of trickster and culture hero that makes him so interesting. So part of our unit on tricksters will be spent with scholars and students of myths who ask, how can someone who does this much damage, who breaks so many rules and so many sacred taboos, be venerated and loved by the people who tell his stories? How can people tell their children stories about a character who does all the things they're trying to teach their children not to do? And this is particularly true of trickster stories of Native Americans and from Africa. And we'll have a lot of good stories to share from both of those cultures in that unit. Our last unit is going to deal with sacred places. We'll be looking in that unit at the ideas of a very brilliant theorist about sacred places, Mircea Eliade, who calls each sacred place an axis mundi, a world axis, a place where the sacred and the profane intersect. Whenever we visit one, he says we aren't visiting just a historic site where something powerful happened once. We are going to a place where we can reconnect with the most powerful forces in the cosmos, ones that created it and still sustain it. There can be many such places in the world, and we'll look at ways of classifying them. In some, an important event happened, making it forever a sacred place. And we know we'll get to visit a lot of these spots in the lectures ahead, like the spot, for example, where the Zuni emerged from the underground into this world, where Shiva caught the goddess Ganga in his hair and turned her into a serviceable domestic river, where in Australia in the dreaming time ancestors left behind traces of themselves that could be contacted by going to those places and performing certain rituals. Other places are made sacred simply by setting them off from profane places in time. Churches and synagogues and temples and medicine wheels are all of this sort, of places where simply entering them puts us into contact with the largest forces in the cosmos. In that unit, we'll get a chance to look at sacred rocks and lakes and mountains and sacred trees, the last either like Yggdrasil, that Norse cosmic tree that unites heaven and earth and the underworld, or some of them less cosmic, but still markers of where something extraordinary happened. All of them are places where we can leave the ordinary world behind and reconnect with the powerful forces of creation. That's a kind of overview, to paraphrase Dr. Seuss, of the places we'll go and the things that we'll see and why we'll be doing these things. The rest of this lecture, the rest of our time we have together now, I'd like to just take a moment to remind ourselves of one of the many ways in which myths are still alive and well among us, even if we're not always aware of them. There are all kinds of people in our own world who are myth makers, novelists and short story writers and artists and creators of movies and television shows and commercials and ads and comic books and graphic novels and music. All of these people are weaving myths for us all the time. So each day, in fact, we're inundated with myths. We're swamped by them. We can never actually escape from them. We'll come back to this idea later in the course, but even our own personal and family histories, our own ethnic beliefs, our religions, our narratives shaped on mythic lines. And many of them depend for their structures and meaning on ancient myths that were left to us by our ancestors. A great deal of modern literature, just to use one example, is based on myths that we'll be looking at in the rest of this course. Sometimes this use can be very self-conscious on the part of the artist, who deliberately invokes an older myth to organize or structure his or her stories. Others can be less self-conscious in that so many of the myths we'll be looking at have become so much a part of our consciousness that when we organize our experience, we automatically use their structures. Some examples of a really self-conscious use of myths: think of James Joyce's Ulysses, which is patterned in very specific ways on Homer's Odyssey, but it's set in a particular day in Dublin, June 16th, 1904. Or think of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which is based generally on the myth of the Fisher King, which we'll get a chance to look at later in this course, and in particular on a reading of the Grail legend by Jessie Weston in a book called From Ritual to Romance. Again, Eliot's poem is set in the early 20th century. Or think of John Barth's Chimera, which retells for modern audiences the myth of Perseus and Bellerophon, as well, of course, as a brilliant retelling of the frame story of 1001 Nights. Or Donald Barthelme's Snow White, which retells the fairy tale by placing it in a modern setting, as does Anne Sexton in her poem Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, in which she calls Snow White a dumb bunny for opening the door to a witch for the third time after she's already tried to kill her twice. Or John Updike's The Centaur, set simultaneously in Pennsylvania in the 1940s and the Greek mythic world, so that Mr. Zimmerman in the book is both the high school principal and Zeus. Or Angela Carter in The Tiger's Bride, which retells the story of Beauty and the Beast for modern audiences. We'll get to take a look at Beauty and the Beast in Lecture 28. All of these myths use myths of the ancient, all of these stories use myths of the ancient Greeks, or stories at least from the Western tradition. But the same thing happens in other cultures, as in the stories of Leslie Marmon Silko, who sets ancient Native American myths in modern dress, as she does in her most famous short story, Yellow Woman, in which a woman lives out an ancient myth in a world full of farmers and white ranchers and pickup trucks. In all of these examples, ancient myths provide structure and coherence and meaning to contemporary events, even if sometimes the myths are used ironically. Another way in which myths can be used, deliberately or not, is a little bit less self-conscious. In these stories, myths provide the bones of the story that seems on the face of it to have very little to do with myth. Of the many examples we can choose, we'll choose the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling, which has been such a sensational success for a long, long time. As many people have noticed, no matter how original and brilliant those books seem, and are, their skeletons are very old, coming, in fact, from the myths that we'll be talking about in the next lectures. Let me just point out two ways in which this works, chosen because I think these two ways will have particular relevance for us later in our course. The first comes from an essay by Wendy Doniger called Never Snitch, The Mythology of Harry Potter. She focuses on the situation of Harry at the outset of the series. He's an orphan living with the extremely nasty Dursley family. The idea of being an orphan is part of a common childhood fantasy that the awful parents that you live with aren't your real parents at all. You came from somewhere else and are far more gifted and special and brilliant than these people that you happen to be living with at the moment. In Lectures 21 and 25, we'll notice that this is a takeoff point for Otto Rank for his monomyth, using a theory that he calls that of the family romance in his study of the hero. Rank says that in normal circumstances, a child begins by idealizing his parents, by worshiping them, but then over time becomes gradually disillusioned with them. And additionally, for Rank, a son's relationship with his father anyway is always complicated by the sort of sense of competition between father and son for the affection of the mother. What happens in Rank's theory is that the child invariably creates a fantasy in which the people he's living with aren't his real parents. And that allows him to hate his parents as much as he wants because they're not his real parents anyway. Eventually, as the fantasy goes, the child will reconnect with his real parents and come into his own and then be recognized for the special person that he is. In real life, as Doniger points out, this is probably the fantasy that causes adopted children to spend so much time looking for their real biological parents. As she points out, it's also a part of the ugly duckling story in which a swan raised by ducks is considered clumsy and unattractive until he can join his real swan family, where he is beautiful and graceful. So we can see how a centuries-old story of the hero can inform one as contemporary as the story of Harry Potter. The second take on this issue comes from an internet essay by Lynn Millam, who places Joseph Campbell's template of the monomyth. It comes from Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which we'll look at later on in this course. It puts that template on top of the Harry Potter novels and movies to see how they match up. We'll look at Campbell's monomyth theory in more detail in Lecture 25, so here we can just sketch in enough to see what Millam is talking about. What Campbell does is to abstract from all of the hero myths of the world a pattern or structure or narrative that can subsume them all, making one grand universal hero story. We'll do more justice to these later, but in a general and simplified way, the stages in Campbell's universal hero story include the call to adventure, when the hero is called out of his normal life into some adventure, crossing the first threshold, which is passing from ordinary life into the one in which the adventure takes place. In the belly of the whale, in which a hero has to die to his old life to be born into the new. And then come sections called the Road of Trials, meeting with the goddess, atonement with the father, apotheosis, and then return to ordinary life. In the last stage, bringing back a boon that can help his fellow human beings. After Millam has taken us through these stages, showing how each stage matches up very precisely with the Potter books, we can't help but have the sense that the deep structure of the Harry Potter novels is from a pattern that comes to us from thousands of years of myths about heroes. A couple of examples should show how this works. At the start of the novel, Harry lives with the Dursleys in a world that, as far as he knows, is the only world there is. His only slightly oblique glance that there may be another world out there somewhere is the conversation he has one day with a snake at the zoo, when it turns out that he can actually understand the snake, and the snake can actually understand him, and Harry winds up freeing the snake just by willing it. But when this happens, Harry has no idea what this moment is about or what it signifies. So in the stage that Campbell calls the call to adventure, Harry is summoned to Hogwarts. It takes a lot of effort to get Harry's attention, especially since he's being screened from the call by his uncle Dursley. Eventually the message gets through. Harry is the son of two wizards who died protecting him from Voldemort, and Harry crosses over into the world of his adventure when he becomes a student at Hogwarts. There's even a special train, a special way into that world. It's that train that leaves from the invisible platform 9 3/4 at the station. In Campbell, the call to adventure and crossing the first threshold are crucial steps for the hero, moving him from the ordinary world one thinks one belongs to into a very different one. This one full of adventure and challenges and danger, but the only way, in Campbell's Jungian terms, that the hero can achieve mastery of himself, maturity, and individuation, and then bring the boon back for his community. Millam, in her essay, takes us through all of the stages in Campbell's heroic quest. One of the climaxes of the quest is the stage that Campbell calls atonement or reconciliation with the Father. Harry has a lot of fathers with whom he can reconcile. He has his own biological father, whom he scarcely remembers. He has Dumbledore, the headmaster at Hogwarts, who takes Harry into his special charge. He has Sirius Black, a friend of his father's and Harry's godfather, who manages several times to save Harry's life. Mr. Weasley, the father in Harry's adoptive family, one of whose daughters he will eventually marry at the series' ends, and even the detestable Mr. Dursley. The last two stages, the apotheosis and return, Harry accomplishes by the end of the series as well. The point here is that the series, the adventures of Harry Potter, in both the books and the movies, captured the imagination of millions of people, not all of them by any means children. In England, there was a special printing which used an adult-looking cover for the book so that an adult could read it in public without having anyone know that he or she was reading a children's book. Doniger reminds us that a long time ago, Mad Magazine used to put a cover on its magazine that looked like a school notebook for the same reason. Many of the millions of people who love those books and movies probably aren't aware that Rowling was drawing on myths as old as the human race itself. Those old myths still pack a lot of power. We could do the same kind of things with Superman comics or Batman comics or graphic novels or any number of contemporary myths, but you probably see the point. Myths are alive and well and are in constant circulation around us in many different guises. Okay, we now have our map in front of us, and I hope that you have some sense of what we'll be doing in the course, and I hope you'll also have a sense that what we're doing still matters a great deal. Next time, we'll get started with the course proper, beginning, as we noted, with creation myths. We'll start out with a definition of the genre of creation myths. We'll look at some of the ways of classifying them into subgenres, and then we'll take a look at some of the oldest myths in the world from one of the oldest civilizations, from Egypt. That's next time.